Okay, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. James Scullin here from the Australia-China Business Council, and we hope you are all doing well and staying safe during these unprecedented and uncertain times. Well, Australia-China relations have certainly been front and centre of the news cycle this week, and I'm sure we'll be discussing the current status of the bilateral relationship. But what we're really looking forward to analysing today is we're looking to take a look at the big picture impact of COVID-19 and what it means for both the Australian and Chinese economies, while also try to imagining what a post-coronavirus world is going to look like with a particular focus on Australia-China economic engagement. To delve deeper in today's themes, we're very pleased to bring you two experts at the top of their fields to help flesh out today's theme. John Daley is the CEO of the Grattan Institute, which is dedicated to developing high quality public policy for Australia's future. John's been speaking widely and writing widely on the impact of COVID-19 on the Australian economy, and it's a privilege to have him join us today. We'll then cross to renowned China correspondent and author Rowan Callick, who's certainly no stranger to ACBC. Rowan was Beijing-based China correspondent for The Australian for 2 terms, following 20 years with the Australian Financial Review as China correspondent based in Hong Kong. Rowan's also written 3 books published in English and Chinese. Now, before I cross over to today's panelists, just some housekeeping. We like to make these sessions as interactive as possible. So if you have a look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A box. At any time during today's session, please feel free to write a concise question for one of our panelists, and we've allocated plenty of time to come to that in the second half of the session. Now, we also are recording today's event, so if you're looking to pass this on to a colleague or client, today's recording will be made available on the ACBC website in the coming days. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to John Daley from the Grattan Institute to take a look at how Australia has thus far responded to COVID-19. John, over to you. It seems like we're having some issues with John's connection there. John, are you there? Okay, well, I think what we might do, Rowan, we might cross over to you and get you to take a look at firstly how China has responded to COVID-19, and then we'll cross back to John once we sort out his internet there.
Okay, James, that's fine. I'm going to talk about, first of all, about the Chinese economy broadly, and then more briefly, international relations, including Australia. So the People's Republic of China was first in, now expected to be first out. And life's getting closer to normal, but there's strict neighbourhood level monitoring still, and testing, and social distancing in public places. China can't relax fully while the virus is still spreading internationally, and new locally transmitted cases are being reported. As a result, school reopenings have been postponed, and cinemas were closed again after a brief reopening. Outdoor parks limited to 30% of capacity. The excellent economic and business analyst Dragonomics say that 53% of those they surveyed still can't get door-to-door deliveries, that 2/3 are back at, of people are back at workplaces, that 15% are back in gyms, that they must still guarantee if traveling, they must still quarantine if traveling beyond their city of residence and again on return. That 53% have visited a shopping mall this month. In economic terms, GDP fell 6.8% in the first quarter, and the IMF is forecasting a recovery to 1.2% growth for the year 2020. Wang Yiming, the former deputy head of the Research Department of the NDRC, the top state planning body, says he believes 3% is the best performance he can anticipate for 2020. Last year, government debt grew at its fastest rate in a decade, since the post global financial crisis stimulus was at its height. At the start of last year, total debt was about US 40 trillion, 304% of GDP and 15% of the global total. The PRC had begun a post-stimulus deleveraging campaign, but the US trade war caused this to pause, with credit limits being eased again and with local governments being allowed to issue special purpose bonds, chiefly for infrastructure. Hence the growth last year in both government and corporate debt. In general, I anticipate that trends already underway before the virus struck will mostly resume. China's deal with the US could, however, prove one of the casualties. A clause allows for fresh negotiations, quotes, in the event of a natural disaster or other unforeseeable events, close quotes. And China could well invoke this in the face of its requirement to buy an extra 200 billion worth of US energy and agricultural products. One of the trends in our region already underway was the diversification of the famous Asian value chains, accelerated by the US-China trade war. Corporations from Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and some other places had already begun to invest more, both at home and in third countries, including Vietnam and Indonesia, to lessen the risk from too heavy dependence on China. But Chinese clusters are very hard to replicate in particular. And China itself has focused on self-reliance, especially in technology with its Made in China 2025 program, reflecting that it spends more importing semiconductors than it does oil. The virus impact is likely to accelerate this trend, I believe, towards greater self-reliance and to a degree also diversification of both supply and of markets. Robotification is another existing trend set to accelerate post-virus in all sectors, including services such as education. Another trend highlighted by market analyst China Skinny is for China's online and offline retail to become dominated by a handful of large tech companies. Quite an important move for Australian companies to track carefully. And China's middle class is likely to resume, perhaps also accelerate, its desire to place one foot in an overseas haven via property purchase, business development, and or student education. National governments are likely to prove stronger in general compared with regional or multilateral bodies, having acquired more powers, being, as usual, reluctant to readily discard them. And the big question remains, as it did 6 months ago, where is demand going to come from? We shall know a lot more after China's Lianghui, its two big postponed annual meetings. The National People's Congress, it was announced a couple of hours ago, will start on May the 22nd. The government's work report, read by Premier Li Keqiang there, will give us a much better idea of the extent and nature of the post-virus stimulant. Beyond that, China's 14th five-year plan will be rolled out early next year, and we'll learn even more then. To summarize, China's emergence has been slower than expected, in part because public health controls have been institutionalized, and in part because second-order economic effects are being felt by lost export orders and jobs. Exports, which comprise about 18% of GDP, are expected to fall by up to a half in this quarter, with industrial profits down almost a quarter. China can't insulate itself against such economic impacts, although it is a society more adjusted to lockdowns than most, because it has been in one form or another in lockdown since 1949. In monetary terms, the People's Bank of China is focused on currency stability. John Edwards, the former RBA board member, says, quotes, "For many years, we can forget about central banks' capacity to stimulate economies," close quotes. And China's is no different. But with ever higher stimulus programs achieving ever diminishing productivity gains in China, and with a quarter of urban apartments empty, something has to give. Might that mean a return to a reform program in which Party General Secretary Xi Jinping has evinced little interest previously, or maybe a genuine boost for the private sector? Well, we'll know more when, as I said, the NPC meets now on May 22nd.
Excellent. Okay.
To Australia, more specifically, we invest a little directly in China, 13.5 billion, which is $1 billion less than we have invested in Papua New Guinea. So let's leave that to one side. China has invested about 40 billion here, making it the 5th largest investor. A quarter of our imports come from China, and a third of our exports go there. And of those exports, 3/4 comprise just 4 commodities: iron ore, by far the largest, as everyone knows, then gas, coal, and gold. And BHP has said recently that steel production may end up actually rising this year if China can avoid a second wave of virus infections. Our income from Chinese students was assessed in the last financial year at 12 billion, and from Chinese tourists at 4 billion. Those revenues will certainly fall. And overall, Alan Kohler, perhaps Australia's most influential business journalist, wrote last week that for Australian businesses that have China as their plan A, they should start thinking about plan B. Close quotes. China, he said, is in danger of becoming a global pariah, and not so much for being the source of the virus, but for its cover-up and lack of transparency. This tension has been reinforced this week by Ambassador Cheng Jingye, who said that in response to the Australian government's call for an independent review of the origins and spread of coronavirus, Chinese people might say, why should we drink Australian wine or eat Australian beef? Such remarks are not new. They're consistent with the trend towards greater politicizing of trade and economic relations more broadly, consonant with the major thrust under Xi Jinping in his new era towards greater global influence. When South Korea adopted a THAAD anti-missile battery to help prevent North Korean attacks 3 years ago, China strongly opposed the move, saying THAAD radar could see into its territory too, and responded with tough economic sanctions, leading to the withdrawal of the huge chaebol lotte from China altogether, and the gradual pullout of other chaebols since. In China, as in some other states, politics is clearly upstream of the economy and certainly of business interests. Xi says, north, south, east, west, and the center, the party leads all. It's impossible for foreign businesses to insure themselves fully, however deep their relationships or record, from political risk. A Global Times article this week stated, the international order is undergoing profound changes and a new order is gradually appearing, close quotes. one in which China and Russia, it says, will work especially closely. While I agree generally with my old boss, Alan Kohler, about the value of having a plan B, that doesn't mean companies junking their plan A, though. A degree of decoupling is inevitable, and China's economic growth will continue to slow over the coming months and years. Firms that have focused in international terms on countries including China purely on the basis of their GDP growth figures will need to think again. If they can find new regular buyers in an economy that in global GDP terms is more stagnant, that makes sense too. But China will remain, of course, hugely important, major market that will continue to reward those who pay close attention to its constant changes and especially to its multi-layered politics. Thanks, James, and everyone.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Rowan. So I see we have a few questions coming in already. If you have any more questions for Rowan, please do so in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Okay, now I think we have a better connection with John. John, over to you.
Yes, and hopefully this time it doesn't die bang on cue. So what I'd like to start off by suggesting is that we're in a world in which both our domestic economic policy, our international economic policy, and international politics depend a lot on health policy. And I don't know that we've necessarily seen just how far those tentacles might go. So let's just start with Australia domestically and thinking about that interaction between health policy and economic policy. In Australia, as with most countries, we face a fundamental strategic choice, or we have faced a fundamental strategic choice. Either one, we let COVID-19 run through the community. We accept that there'll be a significant number of deaths and it has a number of economic effects on the way through. Or alternatively, we attempt to not just suppress the virus, but essentially eliminate it. That means that obviously there's far fewer deaths, and we've certainly argued means probably less economic damage in the long term, although obviously potentially more economic damage in the short term. Now, interestingly, Australia, New Zealand, and really China have all essentially elected for that second strategy of essentially trying to eliminate the virus, at least get it to a very, very small number where coupled with sophisticated track trace testing regimes, you have a fighting chance of keeping it at a very, very low level and therefore allowing a lot of other economic and social activity to go back, maybe not to normal, but certainly to something a lot more like where the world we were all living in 6 months ago. The alternative strategy, as I said, is one in which you essentially let the virus run. You might try and slow it down a bit so that the peak in deaths is not quite so bad, but nevertheless you let it run. Interestingly, that is in effect the strategy that the US is continuing to operate. It may or may not be deliberate, but they're continuing to run at in the order of about 2,000 deaths per day. If you assume that in America, as in other countries, there's about another 2,000 deaths of people per day of people who are either infected and we don't realize it, or who can't get the normal health care that they would get because the health system is under strain. That implies about 4 deaths per day. That implies that if you keep that up for 12 months, a death rate in the order of about 1% of the US population. These are very, very big numbers. And of course, in the meantime, the economy remains relatively suppressed because everybody, for 2 reasons. One is you do have some measures in place in many states to restrict economic and social activity. And secondly, of course, in this kind of world, everybody is afraid to go out. Everybody's afraid to use public transport. Everybody's afraid to kind of meet with their neighbours. Everybody's afraid to meet with their business associates and so on. As I said, that's not really the path that Australia and China have followed. Both of them have followed a path of very aggressively shutting down activity to the point where the number of infections is minimal. That's certainly where China got to several weeks ago. It's where Australia has got to really in the last week or so. Keep this up for a couple of weeks and you start to have increasing confidence that you've really got this thing under control. People always talk about second waves, but second waves don't appear out of nowhere. Second waves appear because either someone with an infection infects someone else, and you don't know about that chain. And of course, the longer you have no infections, the more confident you can be that there is in fact no such chain. It's very unlikely that someone who's asymptomatic only infects other people who are asymptomatic, who only infect other people who are asymptomatic. Sooner or later, they infect someone who's got symptoms. And of course, in Australia, as in China, we're now in a world in which essentially everybody with a cough winds up being tested. Or alternatively, someone comes in from outside of the country. And of course, Australia now has quite strict quarantine measures in place. And my guess is that they will remain in place for the foreseeable future. So that's essentially the world that we're in. Now, let me talk about what are the economic and trade and international political dimensions of that. So obviously, in the short term, the Australian economy, like most economies, seen a very substantial contraction. We've seen, if you like, the primary effects of that. We haven't yet seen so much of the secondary effects of that in terms of businesses that are forced to close. They owe various other people money. That means that other businesses wind up being bankrupt, and you see, or insolvent, and then you see a wave of slowdown across the economy. We would certainly expect some of that to happen in Australia. Obviously, the JobKeeper, JobSeeker, various business supports that the Australian government have put in place are aimed at minimising those effects, but clearly they're going to be there. And then, of course, there's in effect a third wave to go through the Australian economy, which is we're in a world in which global demand is going to be suppressed for quite some time. And inevitably that affects demand for the things that Australia produces, but it also has other drags on our economy. So on any view of the world, the Australian economy is going to be much slower than we expected for several years relative to where we were 6 months ago. That said, I don't think it's going to be anything like as badly affected as a country like America, where this disease is now clearly essentially rampant across the country and is likely to stay that way for quite a long time. And therefore will have an ongoing primary drag on the economy, which at least I think Australia is going to pull out of relatively quickly. Now, what are the implications of that for Australian trade? Well, when you remember, as Rowan was pointing out, that you know, the vast majority of our exports are essentially mineral deposits of various or mineral products of various kinds, agriculture, and both of those things are going to hold up more or less, or at least that's what it looks like at the moment. Now, no doubt global demand for steel will probably fall somewhat. It looks like Chinese demand for steel may well hold up, but in that world, you know, it's probably not going to be quite as good as it has been for Australian producers, but it doesn't look dreadful. Of course, the other big exports that we've got are international students and tourism. Now, of course, in a world with quarantine borders, both of those industries look pretty bad. But there's an interesting and particularly Chinese twist to this. The one place that you will tend to have relatively looser quarantine arrangements with are other countries that also have no or minimal numbers of COVID cases. Looks like that will probably be New Zealand. And of course, that's aided by the long-term historic relationship between Australia and New Zealand. But it also, at least at the moment, largely looks like China. And that doesn't mean that you would let everybody from China into the country without even taking their temperature, but it does mean that you might be a lot more relaxed about it than elsewhere. And of course, it also goes in the opposite direction. If you were a Chinese international or Chinese student looking to study internationally, given the world that we are in, the United States doesn't look like a very attractive destination for study right at the moment, because there's a piece in the New York Times today, although many of the US universities would no doubt like to believe that they're going to be opening in September, they are going to need to be very lucky. Whereas the chances of Australian universities having significantly more face-to-face classes come July is actually starting to look reasonably plausible. That maybe they're not running at 100%, but they're certainly going to be running at, you know, more than just online classes. And so if you are a Chinese student looking to study internationally, Australia is looking a lot more attractive relative to its English-speaking competitors than it did, say, 6 months ago. Not that we were doing badly 6 months ago, but the alternatives have just got a lot worse. And I think that, and the same also runs for tourism. Now, it's Of course, if you impose a 2-week quarantine on tourists, basically nobody will come. But if you are prepared to let people in from countries that have very few cases of COVID, then it is possible that China, which has supplied, quite a large proportion of Australia's tourists for a long time, might be one of the countries we allow in, and with less than a 2-week quarantine. And of course, the same thing also applies. If you are someone from China looking to have a big international holiday, Europe and the United States right at the moment are not looking that attractive. Because if nothing else, the Chinese government will impose a quarantine on you on the way back in a way that plausibly they may not from Australia. So I think it's a really interesting situation that we are in, that we may well be back in a world in which the logical trading relationships for Australia are dominantly between Australia and China as opposed to elsewhere. Now, of course, against that has to be balanced the politics. As Rowan says, international trade is always, partly a function of what is and is not possible with international politics. Rowan knows far more about that than I do, so I'm not going to elaborate on that, apart from to say Australia has plenty of economic reasons to think about the way that this new world might be playing out, a world in which essentially we can expect more potential for visitors, both students and tourists from China, than from a lot of other places. Indeed, in a funny way, there's an enormous opportunity here. No doubt the overall market for Chinese tourists or Chinese international students has shrunk. But Australia's share of that market might well increase, and not just by a little bit at the margins, but by a lot over the next few years whilst this crisis continues to play out. Because the reality is we are never going to be in a post-COVID world. We are always going to be now in a world that has COVID, but there are going to be different countries that are coping with it in different ways. And for the moment, the dominant strategy for both China and Australia, but not the United States, is essentially keep your borders tight, keep the number of infections down to 0 or very, very close to it, and otherwise try and let both your domestic economic and social activity and your movement of people with other countries that are pursuing the same strategy to go back to something that looks a little bit more like the world we were in 6 months ago.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, John, and thank you, Rowan, for both of your presentations. We have a bunch of questions coming through. If I can just start a quick poll here. I'd just like to ask everyone attending today's session how important you see Australia's relationship with China being to Australia's post-COVID economic recovery. If you can just answer that brief question, we'll come back and have a look at that at the end of the session. John, can I just follow up on your optimistic point about the potential for Chinese students and tourists coming back sooner to Australia than anticipated? What mechanism or infrastructure or app do you see as essential to help bridge and facilitate students and tourists coming back to Australia? Is it more about just trusting that the situation in China has improved and that we can trust that anyone who comes from China is healthy, or is there some type of policy response required from the Australia side to help streamline this a little bit?
Well, obviously you'd need a big change in current Australian policy that doesn't let anybody in who's not a permanent resident or a citizen. So that'd be a place to start. But more to the point, you're going to want as much confidence as possible that China truly is a more or less COVID-free country. Now, that I will confess I have more confidence about than most people. We know that this is a disease that spreads pretty quickly if you don't have very substantial restraints on activity. We know that, in a lot of ways, activity in China is going back to, if not normal, then something that would lead to infection rates of a lot more than 1. And yet we don't see a lot of dead bodies piling up. And one of the things we know about these kind of epidemics is if it is an epidemic where the infection rate is more than 1, so it grows exponentially, and it is an epidemic where the death rate is material, and that is
clearly true in this situation, then if you don't truly have it under control, the bodies start to pile up within a month or two. And no matter how repressive a regime might be, it is very hard to conceal a lot of dead bodies. People tend to notice. And so, you know, I actually don't subscribe to the theory that, you know, the Chinese government is engaged in some enormous cover-up of, you know, the fact that this infection is still rampant in China, because if that were true, then there would be a lot of dead bodies that would be very hard to conceal. Now, that said, you know, you probably want to maintain some restrictions at the border. You're definitely going to want to impose a test on anybody who walks in. You are probably going to put them into a mild quarantine for a couple of days and test them again at the end of that. But precisely because they're coming from a country where you are reasonably confident that there's very, very little COVID, you might well be a lot more prepared. You might well require people coming in to sign up to your COVID Safe app and to keep it on as a condition of their visa and so on. But you look at all of those things and none of them look unmanageable. Now, of course, this has to be seen against the politics. If Australia wants to engage in a Cold War with China, then none of this is going to happen. But I think that as we think about whether we want to engage in that Cold War, thinking about the opportunity we might be foregoing, at least from a trade perspective, would be something I'd want to put into the mix, even if it wasn't the only thing that I thought about.
Excellent. Okay, well, thanks for that, John. Rowan, we might come to one of the first questions from the audience to you. This comes from David. It sounds like the world will try and decouple from China's supply chain. This will in turn lead to a slowdown of GDP in China. Do you agree? And if so, how bad will it be in Australia?
So, yes, a decoupling would be bad for China, obviously. I mentioned exports, 18%, and of China's GDP, a lot of jobs. And already millions of jobs have gone. We don't really know how many so far. So a big decoupling will be a loss of substantial markets, will be a pretty terrible thing for China, particularly in job terms. And a decoupling would also be a blow in import terms, because China relies, I mentioned there that it pays more for semiconductors it imports than it does for oil. So if the nations that supply it with semiconductors were to, for some reason, refuse to do so, then that would immediately block a whole load of the production of a whole load of other things in China. I don't think decoupling is going to involve a kind of difference that we saw. So some people use the word Cold War, and that immediately makes people think of what happened, of the state of play between the USSR and Western countries in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. We can't go there, in my view, because China is pretty thoroughly enmeshed, and other countries in the rest of the world and other countries are enmeshed in China. This is such a very different profile from the one that the USSR had. So that's why I think the phrase of Cold War is not really very helpful. So I don't think we're going to go there. But decoupling in terms of maybe companies I mentioned looking for more diverse places in which to invest. This kind of thing is, I think, quite likely to continue to happen. I mean, you can see why Taiwan, for example, offered incentives for this to happen, had some positive results as far as the government there is concerned in 2019. And you can see why that's happening to some extent with large Japanese corporations. But they're not pulling out. So this is not a sort of clean break. So Taiwan, Japan continue to have enormous economic enmeshment with China. So I think less is quite possible, and this is not a total disaster for China to see less, because China itself has had for a decade or so a plan of shifting from a focus on exports and investment towards a greater focus on consumption and services. And many of those products are domestically produced. So it's not a sudden wrench, but perhaps an acceleration of trends already underway.
Rowan, I saw that the Japanese government, as part of its economic stimulus, has tried to incentivize Japanese manufacturing to leave China. And I guess that's a policy leading towards decoupling. I just wanted to ask, how has that been received in China? And as far as official government policy is concerned, is that something, do you see other countries potentially taking, as there's maybe a move towards decoupling?
Yeah, well, Japan is a country with a fairly compliant culture, so one may expect this to start to happen. Japan has a massive investments in China, but we're talking about investments in manufacturing. So these are not things that happen overnight. So this is very different from the Australian position, where we, as I said earlier, are hardly invested at all in China. So, you know, a ship can go take iron ore to Seoul, or it can take the iron ore to Shanghai. You know, that's a very different situation. So I think that we haven't heard too much of a kickback inside the public realm so far, partly for other reasons, because as the China-US relationship deteriorated, Japan itself growing anxious partly about Trump's interest or capacity to maintain American trading relations with Japan, and to maintain the important strategic defense relationship with Japan, decided to move slowly towards defusing tensions with China. And so we've seen Japan-China relations improve. Indeed, Xi Jinping was due to be in Tokyo last week, and obviously he's not, but I think he may go back there. Japan was sent a large number of medical masks to China in the very early days of coronavirus, with a message of a saying from Confucius on the masks. This gesture went down very well, and so China's not kicking out greatly against what Japan is doing. Of course, as I said, China's doing it itself in a way, and Made in China 2025. And indeed, we in Australia have seen results of China's changed investment policies in terms of what even private companies as well as state-owned are allowed to do. Japanese companies are free to ignore those directions from Tokyo, but the culture is less likely they'll do so.
Okay, now we have a few questions I might just try and combine. What do you make of the call for an inquiry into the origin of the virus? What are the driving forces behind our government calling for this? Is it in our interests, and where will it lead? And then I guess following on from that, what's Rowan and John's view on the Chinese ambassador's remarks on Monday? Well, John, if you wanted to make a comment about that.
Why don't I start first, and then leave all the hard bits to Rowan. Obviously, understanding what happened and what we could do better in future is really important. One of the reasons that many of the Asian countries many countries in Asia have done better better in responding to this, obviously China, but also Taiwan, a number of other countries, is precisely because they had a near-death experience with SARS. They had a much better system in place for tracking and tracing the evolution of an epidemic through their society. They were much quicker to shut borders. They were much quicker to control movement. And that was precisely because they looked at what happened with SARS. They did an investigation and they figured out what they needed to do differently next time. So I think there is certainly an overwhelming case to do that in Australia. And given that this is necessarily an international game, because by definition pandemics are international, something that it is appropriate to do in an international way. Now, that begs questions of exactly what kind of inquiry this is and what its real purpose is and so on. And it's easy to see how it could be turned into a purely political instrument. Not sure that that's really in Australia's interests to turn it into a purely political instrument. And I think we should be careful to make sure that it is not designed in that way.
Mm.
Yes, well, it's I have to agree. It's received knowledge that you don't call for an inquiry really unless you know how that's going to proceed. And I've been a bit surprised because there's no question of China agreeing to an external investigation. The party owns all information in China, so it's not going to make that information available to an outside agency. Even the World Health Organization, and the World Health Organization is a body that's been criticized for being too pro-China, partly because Beijing played a major part in lobbying for the appointment of Dr. Tedros as Director General and so on. We won't go into all this, but China's traditional position has been to oppose what it calls any investigation of its internal affairs. That's been suggested about what's happened in Tibet, what's happened in Xinjiang and so on over the years, and always rejection. And so it's most unlikely that that's going to happen. I can see why it's valuable to know where this virus came from, what caused it, and so on. I don't think it's going to happen. We had 4 years ago the outcome of South China Sea case brought by the Philippines to International Court of Arbitration in The Hague. China just completely refused to participate in the process and ignored the findings. So this is what would happen. So that question about why is Canberra pursuing this, I'm not really sure. It's using up an amount of political capital. Maybe there's a feeling that there's a domestic constituency that people in China, people in Australia will applaud the government for doing that, and there's some anecdotal evidence for that. There's maybe some feeling that international allies may support us in doing this, like in Washington, but they haven't really come to the table so clearly. So the second question is, how does China respond? Well, China's responding as it has learned to do under Xi Jinping, and there's a lot of value to be gained by people inside the Chinese system now for guessing how tough might be Xi's response. And so we see the Ambassador Chen talking in these terms, talking about the possibility of economic damage being caused, and that's not surprise, not a mystery, but it's the way that China these days is prosecuting itself internationally, and some people find that discomforting. It's quite pushy, but that's what we have, and that's what we need to deal with now, and maybe to expect. So I would have expected that kind of response when I'd made that kind of appeal if I was a government minister in Canberra.
Okay, well, certainly Australia-China relations are in a very low point at the moment. I'd like to now turn to maybe some a proactive approach with regards to the ACBC and its members about, you know, what can be done to improve the bilateral economic relationship. A question from Bruce is, it's pretty clear that tensions between Australian and Chinese governments are going to ratchet up. The last time we got anywhere close to these levels of tension, we saw the blockade of Australian coal. This time there's a strong risk that it will be worse. What can Australian companies and the ACBC do to minimise the impact of these tensions in their business? And I also have a question from David Thomas. Great point about Chinese tourism and students. What about the politics and the media? Australia looks likely to start a Cold War with China. What needs to happen to turn things around? What can and should we all be doing, including ACBC members? So I guess both of those questions are looking to perhaps more of a pragmatic approach from, if you're an Australian business and you want to take an active role in helping to ease the tensions in the bilateral relationship, what could a business do?
Look, I think it's a difficult challenge, and I think one of the things that's really, you know, it's happened throughout the COVID crisis is that our policymakers have tended to be, you know, a week or two behind the curve rather than a week or two in front of the curve. And I think that this is another example of it, in which, you know, we're still playing international relations and international trade according to the old rules. And I don't think that we have sufficiently quickly adapted to the fact that international trade and international politics also now have to take into account essentially health considerations, the spread or otherwise of COVID, the response or otherwise to COVID. You know, therefore, just reacting in the same way that we always have is maybe not the right answer. You know, I think that many people remain remarkably sanguine about the effect of all of this on United States power. No doubt their military will continue to be very powerful, but in terms of its ability to get things to happen, it's in terms of its relationships, this is going to have a material impact. And anyone who hasn't kind of figured that out, I think, is not looking at the numbers. You cannot have an epidemic that kills in the order of 1% of the population running rife in one country and not in other countries, and expect that to have no impact on relationships. And I think it's something that you know, one place to start is to essentially start talking about this world, because I can't see any likely alternative to it, in which the bottom line is that movement of people, if not goods, between countries with COVID as opposed to countries without COVID is going to be very different. Now, that's a kind of alignment of international trade and politics and movement and all the rest of it that's just kind of totally different to anything that we are used to. And I think it's going to take people a little while to get their minds around the fact that this is now not the only consideration, but certainly an important consideration. I think one of the things that can help is to start talking about the fact that this is the world we're in. And, you know, we say, oh, well, how could we possibly do that? And, you know, you don't have to go back very far. And Australia had quarantines against people who had TB. It had quarantines against people who had polio. You know, actually, the last 30 or 40 years have been the aberration. Before that, quarantines were normal. And you drew distinctions essentially based on where you were coming from. And those were based on, you know, what do we know about the health, public health of the countries that you're coming from? Ironically, we've probably got way more information about the public health of countries that you're coming from today than we did 30 or 40 years ago. So the first thing I would do is to talk about the fact that this is now a relevant consideration for international trade and politics. And we need to get our minds around the fact that that's a brave new world. The second thing I think we need to do is a kind of pretty straightforward one, which is just to talk about the actually the opportunity that this presents for Australia. Now, you know, everybody's always a little bit loath to talk about the idea that a crisis like this creates an opportunity, but I think the reality is that it does. You know, if you can take 10, 20% of the total market for Chinese students or tourists, right, that is a big deal. And so I think it's at least, even if we choose not to go down that route, we should at least have a long, hard discussion about whether that might be a good idea.
Well, John, I think a lot of Chinese speakers will agree with you that the Chinese word wei ji for crisis has opportunity embedded in it. Just before we cross over to Rowan, John, do you see these changes affecting Australia at the ballot box at all? We've got a question asking, in recent years, we've seen democracies around the world voting in ways that can be interpreted as against their economic interests. Brexit in the UK, TPP in the US. Is Australia at risk of making a similar collective mistake?
Possibly, but the divide essentially around attitudes to migration in Australia, as indeed elsewhere, has tended to be essentially cities versus regions. One of the things that's very different about Australia, of course, is that 2/3 of the population live in our 4 biggest cities. So inherently, that's the way that elections at the very biggest level tend to go. And again, that's a question of what Australian politicians do. Politicians can either inflame those divisions or they can, you know, try and play them down. And I certainly think it's in Australia's interest to continue to play them down. Of course, ironically, I suspect it will become harder for politicians to inflame those going forwards, because one of the things that has stoked those kind of tensions has been the size of Australia's migration intake. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting it was a bad thing. I'm just suggesting that there are people in the community who got nervous about that. Actually, primarily places that migrants didn't go to in regions, but nevertheless, it made them nervous. Now, of course, we are now in a world in which there is minimal migration. In fact, it looks very likely that overseas migration to Australia will be a negative, i.e. we will see a net movement of population away from Australia over the next 12 to 18 months. My guess is that one of the consequences of that is that, in fact, these tensions about migrants will, in fact, tend to diffuse, precisely because there's very little migration.
Okay, thanks for that, John. Rowan, could we just come back to you for that previous question about what Australian businesses and ACBC members can do to help do more pragmatic things to smooth over the bilateral relationship?
Yeah, sorry, James, I don't have any great list of suggestions for you. I think it's quite hard. I think some rethinking is necessary. I think we've tended to passively accept too much some of the talking points that come out of Beijing. You know, that are you for China, or are you for the US? Are you for Australia? Are you for who are you for? This kind of binary stuff is a problem, and I think we need to also be capable of separating in our minds China from the Communist Party of China, from the People's Republic of China. Again, this is a classic campaign that's been run quite successfully for a long time, that if you criticize China, if you criticize the government, the state or party, then you're anti-Chinese or you're racist or something. So I think have to rethink some of these way that people talk. I think it's necessary for Australian business to re-engage with the broader population. I think the broader population has moved into a different place. You can look at, say, Lowy Institute polling has changed quite radically in recent times, and people have indeed been said, we're willing to vote against our economic interests in favour of our values. And I think what we've seen is values coming to the fore alongside interests in foreign policy. So there are a lot of changes happening here, partly as a result in response to the big changes wrought in this era that Xi Jinping has brought to China. And so I think Australian business needs to listen to people who are critical of the PRC, needs to get alongside and to try to walk with the population, because the danger is we in Australia will have too big a gap between our elites and the broader population. That's a very uncomfortable position, one that I think people who don't have Australia's best interests at heart can take advantage of. So I think we need to step back, think of what's been happening in the last few years, and look at the changes in the way that people are thinking about the PRC, people are thinking about China. My view is that Australian people remain very supportive of Chinese people, of Chinese country, of Chinese culture and value, and I think they enjoy having Chinese workmates and neighbours. I don't think that's changed. So I think that there are opportunities for shifting views, and I think on the other side, of course, you've had one or two questions there. People in the government some people in the government have also become too binary in their thinking. So let's see some more conversations happening at this time.
Well, here definitely for an enhanced focus on people-to-people connections between Australia and China. That brings us to the end of today's session. I'd like to thank Rowan and John for your expertise and insight in this very influx topic that's obviously very relevant to us here at ACBC. I'll just publish the results of our poll. That should be on your screen now. So 71% finding China being critical to Australia's recovery, and 29% a great deal also shows that China is going to certainly play a great role, as it did in the global financial crisis. So thanks a lot again to both of our speakers. I really appreciate you coming on today's ACBC webinar. And I'm sure anyone interested in Rowan and John, they will both be writing and speaking more on Australia's response to COVID-19 in the coming weeks. Thank you both, and thank you everyone for attending. I hope you have a great day. See you.
Thank you.